David Waskow is a member of the Parents Climate League Expert Advisory Council. In fact, he's a founding member of the council, so we're lucky to have him as part of our group. David, as most of you know, is a long-term veteran of the COP. He's been to, he just told me, 14 in a row, which is some sort of self-flagellation, I think. But the rest of his time, he is the director of the International Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute, WRI. The initiative is focused on international cooperation that can catalyze action on climate change at the national level around the world. David is widely known and respected in the climate community as a voice for climate action and equity. Before joining WRI, David was the Climate Change Program Director for Oxfam America and was the International Program Director at Friends of the Earth US. Holds an MPA in Public Policy and an MA in Religion and a BA in History. So David, welcome and thanks for agreeing to do this.
Sure. Thank you all. And I want to do this as much of a conversation as possible. And I'm sure you all have read fairly widely about COP26. And so we'll have some sense already of what happened there. So I'll be relatively brief about some of my takeaways from this most recent climate conference, climate summit in Glasgow, and then we should get into a conversation. So as Michael said, this is my 14th COP in a row, an interesting long haul. And in some ways, I think, although there's certainly been some very interesting and quite momentous COPs, including Copenhagen and Paris, I think in some ways this is the most complicated COP I've seen. And I've been saying that it's a bit of a prism, in fact, and as you turn it, you see different things. And in part, that's because there were so many different dimensions to the COP. As with all COPs, it had the negotiations, and I'll come back to that in a bit. And in addition to that, there were also the national commitments of various kinds that led up to the COP. And so there was a long process, in fact, before the COP even happened in terms of those national commitments. There was a World Leaders Summit at the beginning of the COP with over 100 world leaders, heads of state and government, and then also a number of different sectoral events and announcements and initiatives during the course of the COP, including many with non-state actors, with businesses, cities, states, et cetera, and touching on a whole variety of sectors. And so it really was a COP that had many, many multiple dimensions to it. One of the things that I think is important just as scene setting and thinking about the COP is not to see it as a sort of single moment in time, in part because of some of the things I just said. And I've sort of seen it as a three-phase process in a lot of ways. And the first phase, so a three-act play, if you will. So the first phase really was leading up to the COP, and there was a roughly year, 18-month period leading up to the COP when countries were making various kinds of national commitments. Some of those were in the form of 2030 targets, some of them net zero commitments for the mid-century or mid-century-ish period. Some of them were on finance. And that run-up, I think, was quite important. It was, of course, longer than would normally have been the case because the COP was postponed a year due to COVID. So that brings us up to the COP itself. The first few days of the COP were the World Leaders Summit, was the World Leaders Summit, and also many of these sectoral announcements from various actors. So that was really Act Two in a lot of ways. And then the third act was the real detailed negotiations and looking at what would come out of the COP in terms of agreement among countries. and in a lot of respects, that was looking forward. That was not about what had come thus far with the national commitments. It wasn't about all of these other announcements. It was, where do we go from here on a number of fronts? And that then, of course, puts us into the next drama, essentially, which is where we go from COP26. So that's a sort of just a bit of a chronological way of framing what happened. Let me sort of delve into some of the very specific issues. And one of the key questions, of course, not the only one by any means, but a critical question, obviously, is around emissions and where this left us in terms of emissions. And I should actually say, before sort of delving into this, that this COP, and this applies across the board in some ways. This COP, I think, has been difficult to digest. It's taken me a while to digest it in some ways. I think partly because of the complexity, but also because the outcome was good in some ways and not what we would have wanted in others. And sort of having a sense of both that progress that we've made and also not being where we need to be at the same time, and holding those two truths at the same moment is not always so easy. And I think that is one of the sort of broader takeaways from the COP, is that we have to take on board and recognize how much headway has been made in a whole set of ways, but also that at the same time, we just are not where we need to be, and things are not fully on course for where they need to go. So with that as sort of broader context, so I think that plays out most notably in terms of emissions. And we did clearly make headway coming into the COP in terms of the commitments that countries have made. And most notably, we saw that with net zero commitments. 19 of the G20 countries now have a net zero commitment of some kind. Some of them are fuzzier, less sort of embedded in law or made in a very clear way than others. And the timelines are different. There's a number that are for 2050, but also some for 2060, and one, India, is for 2070. But nonetheless, we do have now some kind of net zero goal from those major emitters and others as well. That is a reality, you know, that does carry us some way. And the IEA did analysis that showed that would get temperature change down to about 1.8 degrees Celsius. So not all the way to the optimal Paris target, the target from the Paris Agreement of seeking to get to limit temperature change to 1.5 Celsius, but 1.8 does get us quite a bit of the way there. We also have 2030 targets that don't get us quite as far. And I should say, actually, as context, that we went into this whole round of setting targets at 3 degrees, roughly. You know, there's a sort of band of uncertainty around that, but the targets that we had for and they were mostly for 2030 heading into this COP would have put us on course for a 3-degree world, give or take. So clearly the net zero commitments would be a lot better. And we have new 2030 targets that are somewhat better as well, but not as good as where the net zero commitments would take us. So the 2030 targets in aggregate, according to the analysis that was done during the course of the COP from a couple of outfits, would be either 2.4 degrees or 2.5 degrees. So a lot better than 3, not as good as the 1.8, certainly not as good as 1.5.
Can I interrupt you for a second just to clarify? Does that mean that if the 2030 targets then become, if there's no improvement beyond 2030, then the implication, or then the projection is that we're at 2.4?
Yeah, if one extrapolates outward,
yeah.
if one extrapolates forward, what the 2030 targets would mean in terms of likely trajectories.
In terms of a 2100 temperature, yeah.
It would land you, it would land you at 2.4, 2.5.
Okay, thanks.
So, as I said, we went in with a sort of 3-degree trajectory ahead of us, and we're now, in any event, including with the 2030 targets, clearly better off, but not better off enough, and a lot of distance to go. So that, as I said, that's a reality we have to sort of grapple with, and I think absorb the notion that we're doing much better. Things are headed in the right direction. Paris, of course, was premised on the idea that we would come back iteratively, and that this wasn't going to be a one-off. And in fact, the reason that countries have come back is that the Paris Agreement has embedded in it a set of cycles for every 5 years to keep returning with stronger and stronger targets over time. And that got postponed from 2020 into 2021, but that is still the moment that countries were responsive to. I should say, by the way, that we and others have been looking at, we at WRI and others have been looking at the question of where the 2030 targets are relatively aligned with net zero and where not. And there are definitely countries you can point to where it's off track, particularly those that haven't enhanced what their targets were coming into this process. And Australia, Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Russia essentially stand out. And China did strengthen its target, but in a fairly incremental and somewhat limited way. So there's still, with those countries, and you could point to others, but with those countries, there's certainly a way to go. Now, what's good coming out of the COP with all of that as the sort of backdrop for where we ended up with negotiations, where we came out of the COP was that there is a push in that final decision text that countries agreed to come back with better even sooner than would have been the case under the Paris framework. So Paris would have you coming back in 2025. It's now essentially agreed that those should be 2035 targets that countries will come back with in 2025 as part of the regular cycle. But the outcome at Glasgow also says that countries that haven't strengthened their ambition enough to be in line with 1.5 degrees should come back next year, revisit their targets, and come back with stronger by the end of 2022. So that helpfully adds a push. I think we now have to see who is that applies to, and who in fact can move and who can be moved in the coming year. So that is a critical question going forward. There's some other hooks in the text, including around sort of urging countries to come with long-term strategies for the middle of the century that are net zero aligned strategies. So that also helps. So the text, although we landed in a mixed place in terms of the emissions story, I think that text helps what the countries agreed to in terms of pushing the agenda forward in the course of the next year in particular. So that was a critical dimension of the COP. There were also all these sectoral announcements, as I mentioned, and those were largely outside of the negotiating rooms. Those were not things that actually got dealt with in negotiating space. And there was a long string of them. And I think the question there is how to bring those to ground, how to make them reality. And so some of them included an agreement that, or a sort of declaration, a pledge, the global methane pledge that was led by the US and the EU around methane. Countries, over 100 countries collectively said they would reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030 below 2020 levels. So that is impressive. Getting it to happen, and that it's a collective pledge. So it didn't, no country was signing up for their own specific target. So getting it to really come to ground in particular countries is going to be key. Similarly, a deforestation declaration signed by over 100 countries that they will aim to end deforestation by 2030. There are some private sector pledges, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, which represented over $130 trillion in assets. But lots of questions about what that will lead to and how those investors of various kinds will actually ensure that their investments are aligned with net zero. And also some questions about where, when they do put funding on the table for green energy, et cetera, where that will go, how much of that's going to go to developing countries or not. And a commitment by 20 countries to end international financing, such as comes from a variety of US sources actually, but the Development Finance Corporation is an example, that support fossil fuels. So no more support for fossil fuels from a number of countries. Other countries that signed up to taking action on coal, coal phase out, phase down, et cetera. So a lot of these sectoral commitments. The one thing that was very interesting in the outcome at the COP, in the formal outcome agreed by countries, was that it also talked about sectors in a way that we really hadn't ever seen before. So language around coal, it ended up being a coal phase down that it refers to. There was a big to-do about whether it was phase out or phase down. Ending inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, some language on methane, and then also some language around nature-based solutions. And so this was actually part of the mitigation outcome and where we would head on emissions in a way that we really hadn't seen before, sort of agreed among countries in terms of very specific sectoral areas to work on. But with all of this across the board, I think the question is implementation. And that's true if you look at countries' 2030 targets. It's true if you look at these big pledges. We really have to bring all this to ground and make it real in terms of the action that's actually being taken, whether it's by countries or investors or others. And that's really, I think, over the next several years, the central challenge, while at the same time, we still need to keep raising the level of quote unquote ambition, the targets that we're aiming towards. So we have this dual challenge that is not an easy one to square up, to focus simultaneously on what actually is getting done on the ground, and at the same time also raising our sights in terms of where we're heading. I'll mention a couple of other areas that were important. One has to do with support for developing countries. And this is when the negotiations sort of take the stage, and you leave behind these big announcements, these questions around what's going to happen in terms of climate finance that supports developing countries. What's going to be done in terms of the impacts that they're facing? How will they be supported with their efforts to decarbonize? All of that really becomes very central in the negotiating context. And I think we saw a really mixed bag on this, frankly. Coming into the COP, one of the key questions was, how far would developed countries go in terms of meeting the goal of mobilizing $100 billion a year for developing countries? And the story is that the estimates that the OECD has put out are that won't be met until 2023. So a lot of disgruntlement from developing countries about the fact that things are behind the pace that they're meant to be at. That was meant to be achieved in 2020. So that is a gap. There's some question about whether some of that gap might be filled by overachieving the $100 billion over a few year period, but not really clear. So that was sort of a context going in. One of the good things that came out of the COP was around finance specifically for adaptation, for building resilience to climate impacts. And there's a commitment in the COP outcome from Glasgow that the developed countries will double their financing for adaptation to developing countries. And I think that was a real bright sign in the entire mix. There was also language around really urging that $100 billion overarching goal be met as quickly as possible as well. And then the issue that I think became a really sticky one toward the end, and is, I think, going to be the flashpoint and the sort of one of the key questions on the table for this next COP, COP27, which is going to take place in Egypt. And that's the issue of loss and damage. And this has been, for the last almost decade, a bit of a hot potato issue within the context of the climate negotiations. The issue essentially is how to deal with the impacts of climate change that can't be adapted to, and what to do in terms of vulnerable countries that are facing those kind of impacts. There has been a lot of debate about whether this has to do with liability and compensation. Would it be something that would require putting in place a loss and damage system? Would that require developed countries to pay some kind of compensation because of the impacts to developing countries, to vulnerable countries? I think for the most part, we've left behind that kind of liability and compensation issue. It's still lurking there, perhaps. There's some voices still that would want to talk about reparations or compensation, but there is language in Paris that steers away from that. Politically, the reality is that I don't think that there will be openings for something that would be a compensation regime. What we do have on the table, I think, is the question of how to provide finance for vulnerable countries, vulnerable communities that are facing these kind of impacts. What to do when people lose their homes, lose their livelihoods. Some of that is in the context of acute climate events, what to do with severe weather events that happen, but it's also the case for slow onset events. So what do we do about loss of water supplies? What do we do about loss of ecosystems that support communities? What do we do about loss of land, literally land, due to sea level rise, and where communities are living due to that? What do we do when certain crops can't be grown in areas where they have before, and food security becomes tenuous at best? So some of these issues are ones that have been in sort of in the adaptation frame in the past. How do you adapt to these kinds of circumstances? But I think that we're also seeing that the impacts are growing in ways that mean we have to address what are irreversible changes and what are changes that ultimately can't be adapted to or are very, very hard to adapt to. How do we finance what happens when that occurs? And that includes things like not only loss of livelihoods, but also migration, refugees, et cetera, and what to do about all that. And that's, I think that will become an increasingly burning question, all the more so because of the reality that we aren't at the moment on track for 1.5 degrees. And as I say, even with the current 2030 targets, not on track for 2 degrees. So this will be front and center, certainly in the negotiations this coming year. And I think in general terms, and it's for developed countries as well, frankly, that we have to work through how we're going to address this. The last thing I'll just mention is the Paris rule book, so-called, the sort of detailed rules for implementing Paris. And those were basically finally completed after a fairly long process. And so questions around the framework for carbon markets, for example, is put in place. The transparency, the way in which reporting will be done under the transparency rules is now in place. And so we have the architecture of Paris is sort of knit together more clearly now, and it is an implementation question going ahead. So that's I'll stop there. Happy to talk, have a conversation, and sort of feel free to jump in with thoughts on all of that.
Thanks, David. That was great. I have a bunch of questions. I want to let other people go first. I know I think some people are going to drop early, and I know that there's expertise on this call that I don't have, so maybe more incisive questions than mine. But why don't I open it up first before I ask my own? Don, I don't know if you're still on. Do you have questions or comments for David?
I'm still on. I just also trying to get some lunch. And I thought David had nice overviews. Well done. There's major questions still about how are we going to get to net zero, and whether we can get to net zero. And even some things, we have a discussion going on in Illinois about forcing a transition away from just tools like chainsaws, from gas to battery, and the battery technology is there and is as cheap basically and doesn't pollute, and you don't have fumes blowing into your face as you're using all these machines. And I'm expecting there's going to be a big battle, and this is 1% of the total emissions we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. So we're certainly not there yet, but we got a ways to go.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Todd, any questions or comments?
No, I thank you for the overviews. Great summary of what happened there in Scotland. I guess you mentioned discussions revolving around natural solutions to climate change, and we've seen in the U.S. Congress a number of efforts to put forth legislation that does things like increase incentives for the restoration of blue carbon ecosystems, things like the Trillion Trees Act. There are other legislative efforts that do things to help prop up carbon markets that the forestry and agriculture sector might participate in. Just curious about the international reaction to those types of policies and initiatives. Certainly at least the COPs that I've participated in, it's been a few years now, but the focus has always been on decreasing emissions from the industrial and power sector. But we're seeing more and more of these particularly pop up in conversations here in Washington. So just curious about their reaction and how much of that was in the discussion for possible solutions.
Yeah, so Michael, should I take both of those, or are there others?
Sure.
So just first on the net zero, and then I'll come to the nature-based solutions elements. So I totally agree that how we get on track for net zero is the critical question. And I think that, there's the 2030 targets question as part of that, right? So how do we set trajectories that get us on the path to where we want to be by mid-century or around mid-century? And that is important, because you can't in fact get to 2050 without going through that 2030 point. The other piece is the implementation piece, and I would add that on that, we have challenges. Just to take methane as an example, right? We know that there's a lot that can be done in the oil and gas sector to reduce methane emissions, dealing with leakage issues in the whole supply stream for gas is something that is economically beneficial. It's clear. It's a question of the politics around it and really moving that agenda ahead. But there's also the agriculture and food dimension of methane, and often sort of seen as the sort of problem child in the methane world, right? The solutions are harder. Some of them actually we know, like with rice, how to reduce methane by reducing the use of water in growing rice, et cetera. But there are some real tough ones with livestock, especially. And in order to get to net zero, ultimately, we're going to have to crack some of these nuts, and I think also get started on them sooner than later. So not see them as this, down the line, somewhere off in the future kind of question, but start tackling those tough nuts as soon as possible. The other thing I'll just note is on the net zero front broadly, that one of the things that didn't get noticed very much at the COP, that happened at the COP, was the UN Secretary General announced that he and his team that works on climate are going to convene an experts group on net zero, and it will be aimed at looking at non-state actors, it's a little tough for them to look at the national governments exactly. So they'll be looking at businesses and cities and states in terms of what it actually means to achieve net zero. So for those who have said, for those many companies and subnational governments that have said they're going to step up with a net zero commitment, what does it actually look like to make that credible? What are the kinds of nearer term targets? What are the kinds of transitions that need to be made? And they all draw on work such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative that WRI is quite involved with, and other standards that are out there for how you go about getting to net zero. But I think getting that credibility in place, and for example, for these financial actors with $130 trillion in assets, what does it really mean in practice? For them to do this is going to be essential. And I think the Secretary General's effort hopefully will spur a discussion and help set some guidelines, in fact, for that. On the nature-based solutions, I think this came through very clearly in the COP as an area where there's a lot of support for work. As I mentioned, the COP outcome itself, the decision text had language around nature-based solutions, and more, it mentions forests, which have been addressed in previous COP outcomes and have been part of the mix in the UNFCCC in Paris for a while. But this had a broader ambit actually around nature-based solutions than I think we've seen in the past, and a recognition that ecosystems are critical to the task. There were some other important indicators of support for this agenda. I think the deforestation pledge that a number of countries made was part of that. I think carrying that out over the next decade is going to be essential. Getting implementation for that on the ground will be key. And then there were also, I think it was a couple dozen countries that came together around an initiative looking at soft commodity trade. So trade in forest and agriculture products, and how to really steer that trade in ways that are going to support the right kinds of action on the ground to essentially a nature-based solutions approach to making sure that we have the forests and other ecosystems in place to sequester carbon and also provide resilience to climate impact. So I think it came through. I think there's quite a lot of support internationally, and I think that's been built over time, but I think is also getting to a significantly higher level than it had been.
Robin, you had your hand up. Do you have a question for David?
Yeah. David, thank you very much for this overview. This is great, and welcome back home. A couple of questions. One, you mentioned the effort to help provide guidance on net zero, what it means. And I'm curious whether or not there was a discussion or there will be plans to do that based on industrial sectors, broken down by industrial sectors, or is it broader?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure if the Secretary General's approach is going to look at industrial sectors specifically. Or we'll sort of disaggregate sectors, or whether it'll provide a sort of broader framework for how to go about doing net zero trajectories. I should note that the Science-Based Targets Initiative does have work that's been focused specifically on industrial sectors. So there are a number of companies in that initiative, by the way, is a business-focused initiative, and there are a number of sectors, companies rather, in the steel industry, for example, that have joined up to that. And so there are frameworks and sort of standards in place that companies can adopt that would allow them to get on a credible net zero path.
I'll tell you that it's fascinating, because about 3 weeks ago, I was at the annual meeting for the steel industry, but SMA and AISI, and the entire conference was focused on decarbonization and the efforts towards net zero, both globally and also for the industry as well as within the US, and the steps they're taking. So the message certainly in certain sectors is heard, but for those in what I'll call the secondary, like in recycling, I think it's tougher to know what the drivers are and what will actually push entities to recognize the importance of this and understand that even small steps can help, and what are some of those steps. So getting resources is important. Another question, I'm curious, there's always a lot of non-state entities and NGOs that are present at COP. Were there any, thinking now specifically about parents' climate change, were there any NGOs or other entities that were present, that had a presence, that broke through noise, that were focused not just on youth, but on parents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. And none that were on my radar. There was, the youth presence was very palpable. And in fact, I mean, obviously we've seen it growing over the last few years, but it was quite present, including in the a couple of demonstrations that happened outside of the COP venue itself. I don't think I could have missed it. A lot of things going on, but I don't think I really noticed any clear kind of parents' presence there.
That's a shame.
Or an opportunity.
Or an opportunity. Yeah, exactly. Well put. Thanks, Robin. Greg, any questions? If you're still there. Still there?
Yeah, I had one very general question. When kind of watching the sort of scale and pace that COP has been trying to address these global issues of emissions and regulations and enforcements and monitoring, some have kind of challenged that they're like, I'm not sure if COP is really designed to get us where we need to go, right? Like in a very big sense, like the sort of way it's designed and the way it's trying to approach these questions is like not quite up to the task, as we're like needing steeper and steeper reductions in order to meet targets for what most people would consider like a livable world. My question is, there's obviously, like you said, sort of ambivalence here. Like there's some things that are like, this is progress and there's like concrete improvements. And then there's other ways in which we're like, well, we look at the big picture and are these things really adding up? I just wanted to ask to what extent you felt like as a kind of structure or multinational institution, if COP is flexible enough to make itself what it needs to be to get us across these kind of finish lines, or do you think ultimately there needs to be something, much outside of that kind of a system to get us where we need to go? That's a big question, but it's the one I keep wondering as I'm listening to the micro, like we're in the weeds and I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Still wondering about the end of the world. Any insight there would be, I'd love it.
No, it's a good question. And it does come back to this sort of, well, on the one hand, we have things that can get us there. On the other hand, we're not where we want to be, right? But I think, it's important in thinking about the COP and the Paris Agreement and this UN Framework Convention process that we've had over the past several decades. It's important to bear in mind that it can't be everything, right? And it plays a role. It is one of the levers. It is one of the venues and the avenues through which we can take action. But it isn't we don't have a global government. And so it is not going to be the space that in and of itself, by itself, drives change in the way that we need it. And but it does have an important role to play. The other actors are all out. I mean, national governments have to take strong action. We need local action. Some national governments need to act. We need business actors. And I think what the current international architecture has done well, in fact, is to bring more of that into play in important ways. So Paris, I mean, interestingly, Paris is not a top-down agreement in the sense that it tells countries what to do. It does require them to take action, to come with targets and commitments that are ratcheted up every 5 years, as I mentioned, and it creates a process around that national governments have to engage with. It also requires reporting on what they're doing, and so I see it as sort of a feedback loop. It's not completely bottom up either, right? It's not top down, but it's also not completely bottom up. It's a feedback loop where governments get together and sort of put pressure on what it is that national governments are going to do. So collectively, put some pressure on, they encourage, they nudge, it's a whole set of things. And then countries have to go back home and do the job. And the question in a sense is, how are countries going to do relative to the Paris Agreement? Not how well is the Paris Agreement doing, but are they living up to the ideals and the vision of the Paris Agreement, in essence? And so that's the kind of system that we have in place. I think where the COP has also gotten to become a more effective space is bringing to the table cities, states, businesses. And when you walked around the COP venue, there were the negotiating rooms off in one corner. And off on the other side of the building were these pavilions. Some of them may be a little too expensive for my taste in terms of what they were, but you had these this whole variety of spaces, some of them sponsored by government, some of them sponsored by international institutions of various kinds, some of them a collection of businesses came together under a common banner. We were part of one on methane issues, a pavilion space on methane issues. And these were spaces where you could not only get lots of information, but events were held, various kinds of panels, roundtables, et cetera. And it created this whole ecosystem of action that's not just the negotiating context in itself. And so I think the COP has helped to build that kind of energy and momentum. And again, it's not like those businesses got to go do their business concretely. Cities and states got to go home and do what they're going to do. And so it's a matter of the levers being put in place and trying to create this international lever that's as strong as possible.
The COP has become carbon palooza. I wonder, you said the COP is not meant to be a world government. And I wonder if that's a sentiment that's shared by most of the participants, right? My sense as an outsider is that maybe Copenhagen or something like Don, you're on, you should mute. My sense is that pre-Copenhagen, that was sort of the idea, right? That maybe there was this, if not an actual world government, there was this body that would exist that would, nations would hold each other accountable, and there would be, back in the day when there's still an assumption there'd be a global carbon price, right? That there was some mechanism that would work globally. And I'm wondering if the way you've described it is a very Paris and post-Paris view, and I'm wondering if that's accepted, right? Is that how everyone else sees it too?
I mean, I think, yeah, it depends. I think partly on how much one is steeped in this process, right? And I think for those steeped in this process, or oversteeped like I am, that it's understood that it's not a global government, and that that we shifted from the paradigm, in fact, pre-Paris. And I would say Copenhagen was kind of the turning point in various ways in terms of shaping this new kind of approach. There was the Kyoto Protocol back in the day that had very specific targets for each country. And I think that didn't prove to work for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that the Paris architecture brings on board all countries, and developing countries are part of the mix. The cost one pays, arguably, and I would say also because you bring on the United States, but the cost you pay, arguably, in doing that is that you have to have a more flexible system that allows countries to do some of their own target setting. And you could try to concoct some formulas that would distinguish among developed and developing, different kinds of countries, different kinds of economic development, et cetera. The approach that's been taken is to create that kind of feedback loop instead, where countries do their own target setting, but have to come back with stronger, have to report, have to go through a process of scrutiny. And I think that's, there's quite a bit of wisdom, I think, in that new approach. The question is then, how do you mobilize action across countries at the at the pace and depth that needs to happen. And so that's part of the task, not having this sort of sort of global approach. I do that sort of global governance approach, or global government approach, let me be exact there. I do think there's kind of this public notion that COPs are going to solve everything somehow, right? That we're going to come out at the end of Glasgow and all of a sudden we'll be on track for 1.5 degrees or something like that. I think sometimes the media stoke that. And so I think there's sort of this misconception of what a COP or what the Paris Agreement can actually achieve that's out there. And I think we just have to, keep in mind what it is able to accomplish, and the fact that we need to keep pulling on all these other levers too.
So does that mean that there isn't any talk at the COP of finding other, external processes for enforcement, to add some sort of teeth? You and I had talked at one point about, what's the linkage to trade talks, or what's the linkage to, financing is sort of part of it, right? But is there an outside process that can be a sort of a pseudo enforcement mechanism here?
I mean, the closest that anyone has gotten to an enforcement mechanism is the possible use of carbon border,
right, the border
measures of some kind. And the EU is now the closest to actually implementing such an approach. I think with that approach, it's important to keep in mind that it's focused, at least for the time being, on some specific sectors. So it mainly covers some heavy industrial sectors, aluminum, steel, cement, petrochemicals, plus electricity, since there is some cross-border electricity that the EU countries purchase. So it is fairly focused in terms of the goods that it addresses. And frankly, also, when you look at the trade flows, it's a limited set of countries that it's actually going to have real bite for. Russia and Turkey are the ones that are going to, it'll bite for the most by far. So that is an approach that could be sort of, can be used, but I do think we just also have to keep in mind how far it can go, what it can do. And so it doesn't, beyond that, by the way, the other thing I would just note is that I think our global governance has sort of in this Paris world has grown beyond just the Paris Agreement itself and the kinds of commitments under Paris. So we're seeing much more of these kind of pledges, commitments, agreements among governments even in specific sectors. And so methane is a good example, forests, and you can go down a list of other ones. And I think we're beginning to see something which is a little different from even the Paris conception, which is sort of economy-wide targets, essentially, to something that actually brings to the mix, how do governments cooperate and how do they move forward in some coordinated fashion in some of these very specific sectoral areas.
Interesting, okay. Last question, not about policy or science, but actually more about the carbon palooza. So tell us a little bit about what it's actually like to be there. What does one do if you're not a government negotiator, but you're an international climate initiative guy for WRI or another global environmental group? What's the week or 10 days? How do you spend your time? What's it like to be there?
That partly is a function for me of the role that WRI plays. So we're in a number of spaces simultaneously in some ways. So we do advise governments and also the COP presidency, the UK in this case, and others sort of helping drive the direction of the COP about critical issues and elements in the politics in the course of the negotiations. We also participate in many of these pavilion carbon palooza kinds of events. So there are a variety of those that we're part of, whether it's methane or something. There was a nature, actually, to your question, Ty, there was a nature for climate pavilion that was quite large. there are a whole variety of country pavilions where we do that as well. So, you know, and WRI brings a team of folks who not only are expert in negotiations, but also some of our sector experts as well. And then one of the roles that we play that I think is, or we like to think is pretty important, is that we also do a lot of work informing the media during the course of the COP. And that becomes particularly important when the negotiations get hot and heavy. And the media, you know, some of them have been around this process, some, but a lot haven't. And bringing them up to speed, helping them understand what's going on, framing the stuff that's happening in the negotiating process and the texts that are coming out is an important role. That sort of translation role is one that we play a lot.
Do you think it is the play for you guys that it then circles back, that the negotiators will sometimes read what's being said and it gets incorporated into their thinking, or is it more of a public service? This is what's happening.
I think it does sometimes have a feedback into negotiations, although to be fair, the negotiators and the ministers who are there are often very much in a bubble within the negotiating process.
Yeah.
But I do think it helps to provide context that decision makers are seeing as they, you know, wake up in the morning and look at BBC on the TV in their hotel rooms.
Right. Okay. That's it for me. I don't know if anyone else has any last questions for David before we let him go. All right. Thank you very much, David Waskow of WRI. This was really informative and interesting. So thank you, and thanks everyone else for joining the call.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.